This is an instructional video to install a Boondocker side mount turbo on the 2006-2007 Yamaha Apex. This video is to assist experienced mechanics with the install. It is not a step-by-step video. Warning: if you do not have a mechanical background, you may want to leave this to a professional. The producer and Boondocker are not responsible for any installation failures. This video will not go into great detail on how to disassemble and reassemble a sled. It mainly will focus on what needs to be done to prepare and install the Boondocker side mount turbo. Make sure you keep track of all the parts you remove. Let's begin the process. We first start by disassembling the sled. Remove all the plastic, hood, airbox, and miscellaneous parts. Keep track of all the bolts you remove from the sled. The bolts that hold the plastic to the tank are shorter and a different color than the rest. Make sure you use these bolts in the right place when you put the sled back together. Now we will move further back on the sled, removing the exhaust covers, seat, and tank shroud. As you can see, it is nice to have a few friends help with the install, but make sure your friends have a mechanical background. Unplug both wires before removing the seat. Remove the airbox, noting the two lines attached to it. Remove the old oil tank, but make sure and drain it as to not make a mess. When you start unplugging the electrical connectors, you need to pay close attention to how they are plugged in. If needs be, mark each wire so that you can remember how they were plugged in. Next, we can remove the battery and factory battery box. We will not need the factory battery box on reinstallation. The Boondocker oil tank has a battery holder built in. We need to remove the steering arm that is located along the delta box. We will need to modify this later on.
Tie rod ends are a tapered press fit, and the best way to remove them is to get in between the tie rod end and the part that it's pressed into. Give it a little bit of pressure and then hit this part. Don't hit the threaded part of the tie rod end because it'll swell it up and it'll actually make it tighter. Just hit this part and pop right apart.
We will need to drain the antifreeze next. Now, with the antifreeze drained, we can remove the antifreeze bottle and all of the hoses associated with them. Make sure you pay attention to where the lines went, as we will rerun new lines later on. Remove the park brake and park brake assembly. This will not fit with the new turbo, and you will lose some weight in the process. Now, with all the bolts removed, the brakes unhooked, and everything else removed, we can take the delta box off. We can leave the steering, brake, and all of the cables attached to the delta box. Now we can remove all of the exhaust components. Save all 4 of the rubber mounts located on the exhaust muffler. These will be used later on in the installation. To remove the exhaust, we will want to take it apart in pieces. This will help it slide out from under the sled. To get to the bolts under the tunnel, remove the rubber plugs in the tunnel. This will give you access to them. Look at that, your sled is already getting lighter. Next, we can unbolt the header pipes from the front of the motor. Air tools make this job much easier. With the bolts out, we can remove the shorter header pipes. Be careful not to damage the exhaust gasket. Spin the track and the rest of the exhaust will come out. Loosen the clamps on the engine side, leave the boots connected to the throttle bodies, and remove the fuel system. Make sure and undo the fuel supply and return lines also. Unbolt the antifreeze line from the top of the head, but be sure not to lose the 2 O-rings. Remove the ignition coils. Also remember to reinstall bolts wherever possible. This will make it easier when things go back together.
So once we get through the teardown process, this is where we end up with. This is as far as we need to take this sled apart. The exhaust has been removed, the airbox, all the side panels, the delta box, the steering post. Now we're going to do the head shim, and this is where it gets really technical and really critical. If you notice, we're going to start with we have a perfectly clean bench. It's completely empty. There's not any parts or anything on it, and this is that complex. You really have to be really organized and really clean about the way you do this. Let's get started.
Remove all the bolts on the valve cover. Gently remove the cover and do not damage the sill under it. Remove the 2 black plastic caps, but save the O-rings off of them.
Before we take the timing chain tensioner off of it, or the camshafts, we're going to rotate the motor around to top dead center. You can do that. There's a timing mark down here on the crankshaft. There's a hole. You can see the timing mark for top dead center. There's also marks on the camshafts that we can line it up with.
As you can see, there is an arrow and a line that goes down. Line the mark on the camshaft up with this. Make sure and line both camshafts. Once you have both camshafts lined up, check your timing mark on the AC magneto. If you have any questions on this, refer to the Yamaha service manual. Once we have the engine properly timed, we can remove the timing chain tensioner. We can now remove the camshaft caps. Make sure and take them out evenly so as to not bend the camshafts. With the caps loose, remove them from the camshafts. Make sure you keep track of the way the caps came off. Remove the timing chain guide. This will help with the camshaft removal. Be very careful to not drop the timing chain into the bottom of the engine. Wrap a piece of wire around it to keep that from happening. Now we can begin by removing the head. Take the bolts out in the proper Yamaha sequence. While we are removing the nuts, keep track of all the washers. Do not drop any of these into the bottom of the motor. Unbolt the head evenly. Don't take one bolt all the way out. Do it to proper Yamaha spec.
I'm going to show you the shims underneath these buckets. Each bucket has a shim underneath it, and this has been the #1 cause for turbo failures, is misassembly of these. This bucket is what pushes on what the camshaft pushes on, and then there's a shim down here in the bottom of it. And that shim is there's selective thicknesses. This is how you adjust your valve clearance. The shim fits here on the top of the valve, and it has to fit inside that hole. If you tip this head upside down and this valve falls, or this shim falls out of place, it comes off it'll sit off to the side of the valve like that, and then the bucket will go back down on top of it, just like that. And you can hardly even tell that that's going on. Now what happens is, as the camshaft pushes down on this shim, the shim breaks away the edge of that valve. In about 30 miles, the top of the valve breaks off and the valve falls down into the motor. And usually the valve ends up in the bottom of the motor after it's taken out the piston, the block, and the crankshaft. So you have to practice extreme caution when we're messing with these, and make sure that these do not come out of place. We're going to show you a trick that helps keep them in place, but you have to check your valve clearance when you go back together and make sure that they're still in place.
Cut a piece of 3/4 inch heater hose to length. Add the hose to both the intake and exhaust valves. With the 3/4 inch heater hose bolted in place, we can now remove the head. Be very careful to not drop the timing chain into the bottom of the engine. Keep hold of the wire. Remove the old head gasket and throw it away. Do not reuse it. With our old head gasket removed, we can now check the block and make sure there is no debris stuck to it. If there is, use a plastic scraper to remove it. Check the head and make sure there is nothing stuck to it. If there is, use a plastic scraper on this also. Do not leave any scratches in the sealing surface of the head.
After we've got all the debris off of the head surface and the block surface, it's got to be completely oil free. We use brake parts cleaner because it evaporates completely and doesn't leave a residue at all. You can just spray it on a rag, wipe the oil residue off of the block. On the head we can be a little more liberal with the brake cleaner because it's not going to get down in the bottom of the engine. Make sure that we get this cavity where the timing chain was cleaned out so that when you're setting the head back on, oil doesn't run down off of it onto our gasket surface. Once you've washed the oil off of it, you can wipe it down with a rag. Make sure that we clean the head shim with the brake cleaner also. Wipe the excess off with a rag, the rest will evaporate. We want to be really careful that we don't bend the head shim because it's thin and it'll bend easily. Some of the things to look at on this head shim. Make sure that you have the right head shim. The Apex is labeled Apex, the RX1 is labeled RX1. This 063 is 63 thousandths, that's how thick the head shim is. When we're installing the head shim, we are going to use 2 complete sets of head gaskets. They are 2-piece head gaskets. Don't break them in half. No matter who tells you that you can break them in half, don't break them in half. Use 1 full head gasket on the bottom, a head shim, and then another full head gasket on the top.
Install the first head gasket. Make sure to not touch or let any oil run on it, as this could cause a leak later on. Make sure the gaskets do not get hung up on any of the head bolts. Now we can install our Boondocker head shim. Make sure no oil or fingerprints get left on this, as that could cause a leak. Now we can install our last gasket. With our new gaskets and head shim installed, we can reinstall the head. Be very careful to not drop the head and damage the new gasket. Once the head is in place, press it down firmly to make sure there is no space between it and the engine block. At this point, it doesn't hurt to check things twice. We can now remove our 3/4 inch heater hose, but make sure you twist it so you don't lift any of the buckets up. Now is a good time to check the buckets. Run your finger over them and see if any are sitting out of place. If they are, address that now. We can now begin installing the head nuts, but make sure all the washers are in place before doing this. Start each nut, but don't tighten them at this point. Now you can retorque the head to proper Yamaha spec. With the head torqued and all of the buckets in place, we can now install the exhaust cam shaft. Take your time. Remember, the race is on the mountain. With our exhaust cam shaft in place, we can now reinstall the caps. Make sure and put them in the proper order and tighten them evenly. Don't tighten one all the way.
Mark down on the mag in that window on the side of the engine and the mark on exhaust camshaft. We get this one really close with the chain tight down in here. This is the side that pulls, so this is the side that needs to be tight. And if you start there and you get that lined up, then the intake cam should go in.
We can now remove the piece of wire from the timing chain. At this point, you may need to remove the gear from the intake camshaft to get it to go on. Once it is in place, you can reinstall the gear. Make sure you tighten all of the camshaft caps evenly. With both our camshafts in place and timed correctly, we can now torque the camshaft caps to proper Yamaha spec. Reinstall the chain guide. It may be a little tight, but it will go. To reinstall the chain tensioner, you must take a small screwdriver and stick in the end and turn the bolt clockwise. This will retract the tensioner. Keep track of the gasket in the end to not lose or damage it. With the tensioner fully retracted, keep tension on the screwdriver. Do not release it until it is installed in the engine. While holding pressure on the screwdriver, install the 2 bolts that hold it in the engine and tighten them down. Once they are tight, you can release the screwdriver.
Our timing marks at the top of the camshafts will be a little bit towards the back of towards the rear of the engine because of the extra space that we've taken up with the head shim. So that's to be expected. Now, to make sure that our timing marks are on, we're going to go ahead and turn the motor all the way around, make one full revolution, and make sure that all 3 marks line up again. The dot here, and the line on the mag. We'll make one full rotation of the camshafts, which will be 2 full rotations of the crankshaft.
With one full revolution of the motor, check all 3 marks, the camshafts and the mark on the side of the engine. Remember to check things twice. You don't want to have to tear this back down.
To measure clearance, what we'll do is rotate the camshaft so the lobe is pointing up, and then we'll go in, take a feeler gauge, and you slide it in between the camshaft and the bucket on top of the valve, and that'll tell you how much clearance you have.
Check all of your exhaust valve clearances, not just one. Make sure and do them all.
A special set of feeler gauges that I ground down. They used to be this wide, and I ground them down just on a bench grinder so that I could fit them in between these slots on the intake cam. So if you don't have a narrow set, you could modify a set that you have. If you come to a lobe that does not have clearance, then most likely the shim is out of place in the bucket. You need to address that now before you run the machine. You also want to know how to check your valve clearance, because the turbo sleds, the valves tend to tighten up after 1,000 miles, 1,500 miles. They need to be checked to see if they've tightened up.
Now we can reinstall our head cover. Make sure it is clean. Clean the head gasket also. We can reuse it as long as you did not damage it. Install the gasket on the head cover first. Make sure it is pressed down firmly. Apply some 1104 gasket material to the ears of the gasket. You do not need to go all the way around the gasket, just on the ears. Install the cylinder head cover. Make sure the gasket is firmly in place. Do not tighten it down and pinch the gasket. This could cause a leak. Install and torque all of the head cover bolts. Install the coolant hose. Make sure that the O-rings are in place. You have completed the head shim install. Relax, the worst part is over. Before going any further, we are going to want to tape all of the inlet and outlet holes on the engine. We don't want any metal shavings in it. Make sure and do the exhaust side also. We don't want any metal shavings in our new turbo. Locate the two new aluminum plugs, reuse the old O-rings from the old plastic plugs, and install them in the engine. Don't over tighten these, as you could cause damage to the O-rings. Slide the new exhaust header into place and mark where it rubs on the frame. We will need to notch this with a grinder or a pair of cutters. Once you have it marked, take out the header and cut the frame. This is why we taped up the motor. Reinstall the exhaust header and make sure it is not rubbing anywhere on the frame. We will also need to break one of the little castings off the chain case. With the frame notched and the casting removed from the chain case, we can now install the header. Reuse the old exhaust gasket, but be careful to not damage it. Tighten the exhaust bolts as tight as possible so that you do not develop an exhaust leak. Check one more time that our exhaust header is not rubbing anywhere. We will need to notch our exhaust cover so the header does not rub on it. Block the old exhaust holes and reinstall the exhaust cover over the header. Draw an X between the 4 rivets below the chain case. Use a 2.5-inch hole saw to drill the hole for the exhaust outlet, but don't hit the heat exchanger. Drill out the 4 existing rivets to install the turbo bracket. Before installing the bracket, scrape all of the foam off the side panel. You will want to install some heat tape right here also to keep from melting any of the plastic. Using the 4 existing holes, rivet the turbo bracket into place. We will now begin the oil system for the turbo. For the oil system, the first thing we need to do is remove the bolt from the oil cooler. To do this, you need to bend the tabs down so that you can loosen it and remove it. Now we can remove the bolt. As you remove the bolt, be careful to not lose the O-ring that sits behind the oil cooler. With the bolt removed, we now need to drill and tap it. Drill it with a 3/8 inch drill bit and tap it with an 1/8 inch pipe thread. The drill bit will center itself if you drill it from the back side. Now that we have it drilled, use your 1/8 inch tap to make a really good set of threads. Take your time. Now locate your oil fitting from the Boondocker kit. Teflon tape this fitting so that the oil does not leak, but don't get any Teflon tape inside the orifice. With the fitting Teflon taped, install it in the oil cooler bolt. Make sure there is no Teflon tape inside. Now we are ready to reinstall the oil cooler. Make sure the O-ring is installed properly and align the projection on the oil cooler with the slot in the crankcase. Also make sure that the locking nut is positioned correctly with the oil cooler and install the bolt. With the bolt tight, bend the tabs back down to keep the bolt from backing itself off. Since we have removed the old oil tank, we need to reroute the oil lines to match up with our new oil tank. Take the engine oil line off the bottom of the motor and turn it around backwards. This will let us use the factory bends to our advantage. Reroute it so it is sticking straight out of the sled. This line needs to be cut to go into the bottom of our new Boondocker oil tank. We will come back to the oil system later on. We need to do some other things first. With the throttle bodies off of the sled, we need to zip tie all of the vacuum lines. All the lines. The intercooler in place. Use the 2 remaining rubber mounts from the exhaust muffler to attach the intercooler. Drill with a 5/16 bit. Install the bolts and tighten the intercooler to the chassis. Slide the fuel tank into place, but don't bolt it down as we will need to slide it around. Install the fuel regulator into the fuel return line. The bottom port will go back into the tank, the side port will come from the injectors. Pick a good location to install the regulator. It is tight to install the regulator, so pick the best spot. Remember, the bottom port goes back to the tank. The side port comes from the injectors. Also, don't forget to tie in your boost line to the end of the regulator. Make sure these lines are pressed all the way on and install clamps to keep from having any fuel leaks. The fuel system is high pressure. From our tank, we need to run larger fuel lines. Make sure when you push them on, they go all the way over the barb. Run the new fuel lines into the inlet of the fuel pump. Verify which way the fuel flows so that you will know which side is the inlet and outlet. Using the adapter wire, wire the red wire to the positive lead and the black wire to the negative lead. With the leads secure, we can install the new fuel pump in line electrically with the existing fuel pump. The adapter allows you to do this. When plugging in the electrical connectors, make sure they are snug. It doesn't hurt to use some dielectric grease. Run the outlet line of the fuel pump to the fuel supply line on the throttle bodies. Make sure and clamp both ends. When sliding the fuel line on, make sure it goes all the way over the barbs. Install the clamp and also zip tie the fuel pump down. We can now tighten down the fuel tank and install the shroud. Make sure and use the right bolts for this. We can now install our thermostat and bottles back on the sled. Remove the bottom line off the thermostat housing. The line that we took off the bottom of the thermostat needs to be re-ran with a piece of aluminum tube in between. We need to cut it to length. With the tubing cut, install the aluminum pipe. Use the factory bend to make it look good. Install clamps on all the connections. We also need to rerun the smaller line. On this one we have a piece of copper tubing. With the hose cut, install the copper tubing and secure the clamps on both ends. Use heat tape to wrap up any plastic connectors or wiring that is in close proximity to the exhaust header. It also doesn't hurt to tape up the brake line. Remove all of the foam from this side panel and install a layer of heat tape to keep from warping any of the plastic. If you take your time, it can look very nice. Bolt the exhaust outlet. You can use anti-seize on the bolts if needed. Spin the track over and make sure it doesn't hit the exhaust outlet. If it does, trim the pipe. Finish hooking the turbo up to the intercooler. Snug the clamps, but don't break them. When installing the rubber hose, make sure they are clean and grease-free. You don't want these blowing off. Before we put the plastic panels on, it is a great time to check all the nuts and bolts. As you are installing the covers, make sure and plug in all the remaining connectors. Check and make sure you don't pinch any of the wiring. You may not want to tighten all of the covers as you need to fill the sled with antifreeze and make sure it is circulating. Don't forget to plug the boost sensor and injector line into the Boondocker control box. You will want to drain the oil out of the engine to make sure you have clean oil. Refer to the Yamaha manual for proper filling procedure. It is time to start the sled. Make sure you have added oil and antifreeze. When you start the engine, make sure it is pumping oil. Refer to the manual for this. Make sure the antifreeze is circulating also. After you have done all of this, install a pressure gauge in the fuel return line and set the fuel pressure at 43 pounds. You will not need to leave the gauge in line. Once it is set, it will stay. Let the sled idle, then check for any oil, antifreeze, or fuel leaks and address those now. With the sled idling, we need to set up the Boondocker control box. Refer to the instructions that were sent with the unit. As you can see, there are many features to the control box. Mess around with the unit and become familiar with the settings. The better familiar you get, the easier it will be to make adjustments to the box. Turn the idle up to 2000 RPMs at the bell crank, not the fuel rail. If you did not buy a new seat, here is what can be done to use the original. Make 2 small aluminum brackets and rivet them to the sled. Then bolt the old muffler cover to the brackets and existing front holes. Install the original seat and all the plastic. If you did the install correctly, you will have a fun, reliable, big horsepower sled. If you have any questions or problems, give Boondocker a call at 1-877-522-7805. Although you don't need them, it would be wise to purchase a boost and O2 gauge. Give Boondocker a call. They have these items and many other turbo products in stock. What are you waiting for? Get that sled out and get it on the mountain and see what it can do for you. If we fail to do this, the lines will blow off under boost. Next, we need to change the injectors out with the bigger injectors supplied with the Boondocker kit. Be careful to not round off the screws on the throttle bodies. Remove and unplug the old injectors. pay attention to how they come apart and install the new ones identical. Make sure and remove the seals off the old injectors and put them on the new injectors. The new injectors may sit taller than the old ones. If this happens, we need to space the assembly with the washers and nuts when putting it back together. Now we will double check all of the lines to make sure they are all zip tied. Don't forget the map sensor on the back side. Take the tape off and reinstall the throttle bodies back on the engine. Put the steering arm back on the sled and see where it rubs on the exhaust header. We will need to bend this out of the way so that it does not affect our steering. With a little bit of heat, it will bend with no problem. Let it cool on its own, don't cool it with water. With the arm cool, we can now reinstall it on the sled and make sure it is missing the exhaust header completely. Don't let it rub on the header, as this could cause a hole or a steering problem. Put the delta box back on the sled and make sure all of the lines are out of the way. Don't pinch anything between the delta box and the chassis. Put the side bolts in the delta box to secure it to the sled. We can now untangle the wiring harness and start running the wires to the locations where they will plug in. Take the air sensor that was located in the air box and zip tie it to the delta box. As you go along, it is good to start installing some of the electrical connectors to where they go. Plug in the rest of the connectors. Install the turbo on the bracket. Use the shims provided by the kit. This is also where we will reuse 2 of the rubber mounts from the exhaust muffler. Bolt the turbo to the exhaust header. Make sure and use the exhaust gasket supplied with the kit. Tighten all of the bolts down. Coming from where we tap the oil cooler, run the new oil line to the top of the turbo. This will be the oil supply. Make sure and tighten both ends securely. Check for any place that is rubbing. Cut the oil return line to length. Now put some oil in the end of it to help it slide on. Slide it all the way on. To help with the install of the antifreeze lines on the turbo, we will want to remove the front housing. Remove the C-clip on the wastegate arm and also remove the snap ring on the housing. With these 2 items removed, it will slide right off. Before removing though, you may want to mark both sides to help when putting it back together. Before installing the oil tank, run the new antifreeze line from the oil cooler to the outside port on the turbo. Now run the inner antifreeze line from the inside port on the turbo to the small port on the thermostat housing. This will take care of keeping your turbo cool. With the 2 new antifreeze lines ran and tight, we can put the turbo back together. Line up the 2 marks that you made and reinstall the C-clip and snap ring. With the new bracket that Boondocker supplies, tighten the ECU down to this. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's get back to the oil system. You will need to remove the engine oil line adapter and screen from the bottom of the old Yamaha oil tank. Use the new O-ring provided by the Boondocker kit to install this unit into the new oil tank. Also use the new bolts provided. Snug the bolts down to ensure you will not have an oil leak. Before installing our oil tank, we need to make sure our oil return line and breather are rerouted so they will tie in properly. We will also need to trim these later on. Install the new oil tank. As you are sliding it down, make sure to not kink or pinch any oil lines or wires. Before bolting the new oil tank in place, make sure and hook up the engine oil feed line. This is the line we previously cut to length. Also install a clamp to make sure it doesn't leak. At this point, you may also want to check and make sure it is not rubbing on the steering. Check one more time that nothing is being pinched or rubbed and bolt the oil tank into place. We can now begin installing our hoses back to the top of the oil tank. These need to be cut to length to fit back inside the delta box and the hood. As you are cutting the oil lines, try to make the best use of the factory bends. Take your time and make it look good. Try a few different combinations before cutting the lines. Once you cut the lines, you can't make it grow. We will also need to cut some excess line off of the breather hose that goes down and hooks to the engine. Make sure and get all of the clamps reinstalled and all of the hose fittings tightened. When you are finished, it should look something like this. Now we need to do the same thing with the engine oil return line. Place it in the sled, mark it, and cut it to length. Straighten out the battery terminals. The battery will be oriented differently in the sled. Slide the battery down in the holder and hook the connectors up. Remove the strap from the old battery box and use it to hold the battery in place. Plug in the extension line for the low oil sensor. The Boondocker kit provides you with two new 15 amp fuses. Change both the fuses in this harness with them. The old fuses are 10s. You will also notice one of the fuses is a spare. Install the new filter in the crankcase breather line that used to run to the airbox. When you install the hose to the throttle bodies, make sure they are clean and dry. To prevent any leaks, snug the clamps but don't break them. When installing the throttle cable, make sure it is adjusted properly. If not, your sled may throw a code. We can now begin running all of our boost lines. Your boost will come in the bottom of the controller and out the side to the wastegate. Find a good spot to locate your boost controller. You will want it accessible so that you can turn the boost up and down as needed. The bottom line on the boost controller will go here. The line coming out of the side of the controller will go to your wastegate. Set the intercooler into place, but don't bolt it down. We need to run some lines. Run the two short pieces of hose between the intercooler and the throttle bodies. Install the clamps, but don't tighten them, as we still need to move the intercooler around. Install and tighten the blow-off valve at the end of the intercooler. Now we can install the pressure transducer. This will tell the control box how much boost we are running. First, install the T in the transducer. Put on Teflon tape to keep from having any leaks. You can mount the transducer using this factory hole. Come out of the blow-off valve and into the transducer T. All of these lines need to be zip tied to prevent boost leaks. Now come out of the T and run this line up to another T that will tie into the map sensor and fuel pressure regulator. Zip tie all of the lines. Plug in and run the electrical part of the transducer up by the handlebars. This will plug into our Boondocker control box. Now we can tighten the throttle bodies to the intercooler, also these two small lines. Put the lighting bracket back on the sled. This will help hold the intercooler in place. We will need to drill 2 holes to help